question. Now, it could be the case that people who read and come out of a class of either Herman's or mine with a reading of Paradise Lost, that reading of Paradise Lost may, down the road, flower into something in their lives, professional, ethical, or whatever. But that, I contend, cannot be what we aim at. What our students do with what we give them is not in our control. What is in our control is our responsible performance as academics, that we are up to date in our subject, that we have devised a curriculum that makes sense, that we devise tests and papers and hand them back and have conferences with the students, that we monitor their progress in the understanding and perhaps mastery of the materials. We can do all of that. And then at the end, and I mean this quite literally, God knows, but I don't, what happens. How many times have I've had this experience over the last, I don't know how many years, where someone will come up to me and say, "Oh, Professor Fish, I remember so well what you said in that class in 1987 when you said X, and from that I understood Y and have now dedicated myself to profession Z." And I'm thinking, I never would have said that. I thought I spent the entire semester trying to undermine that academic point of view. And as for profession Z, it would be my wish that no one ever entered it. So what's the moral here? Am I to blame for what this student has taken from my work? No. And just turn it around. Would I receive the credit if a student came up to me and said, rehearsed his or her life, and I found every second of it admirable? Would I then say, oh yes, I did that? Absolutely not. What I did was my job. That's enough.
Simeon?
Well, it is true that at least your book that I read, the phrase value neutrality is actually not used, or value neutrality, or value free. However, the argument that the academic enterprise has to be conceived of or seen as to exist in arm's length relationship to social and political concerns, basically. That the academic enterprise, basically, is not it should be understood in a way that doesn't address social and political issues, basically.
At least addresses them,
okay.
Academicizes.
Yes, but there are many decisions that go into the materials that one exposes to students, basically. There are many things that one has in mind in terms of what you want to accomplish in the classroom.
Yeah.
So the process itself, it's an ethical process.
I couldn't disagree more,
yeah.
because what you're veering toward is the one single statement that I most dislike in all of the contemporary work on these questions, and that is that everything is political. Nothing that is true on a level so trivial that it has no consequence for any lived moment of anyone's life. Everything is political. You say that and then you walk away because there's no therefore that follows from that. But if you want to believe, for example, that my choice to teach Renaissance literature rather than American literature, or my choice in a course to include Rawls and not Nozick is political, I will grant that to you so long as you grant me the distinction that that kind of politics is different from the politics that you exercise when you go into the ballot box or when you contribute money to a candidate. Everything is political, yeah, but there are different forms of politics which are differently appropriated to different contexts.
I didn't.
I would say everything is ethical. Same thing. The only ethics that hold, I think, in academic work is the ethics that I would have under the rubric of doing your job. come to class. Don't have an exalted sense of yourself that allows you to skip every third class. Or in one of the cases that you will read from the excerpts, a guy said, well, my teaching method was to leave my class and have my students work it out. And he thought that that was a teaching method, as opposed to a blatant exercise in irresponsibility. So look, just do the job, and do the job that you were trained to do. And don't have an exalted idea of yourself as a wise, good, value-laden person who is going to produce wise, good, value-laden persons. What I produce, if I'm lucky, are people who know something about 17th century poetry, can recognize it, know what some of the problems are, and can argue perhaps for a few seconds about what the phrase two-handed engine means in Milton's Lycidas. If I can do that, man, I am happy.
Can I ask you perhaps to close us out today with a word to our upper administrators, which is why it would be the case that they should care that we produce a student who has that level of understanding of a 17th century text?
Well, it's not an exclusivity of caring. That is, if I were in another field, economics or chemistry or physics or French, if I were in another field, then I would say that my responsibility was the same responsibility, and that the only argument, if that's the word, that you can make to an administrator is to say that for a long time, this set of texts and or questions and problems has been considered to be important in civilizations of which we like to think ourselves the heirs. That's it. I mean, I'll put it as strongly as possible, if there were tomorrow, by some kind of fiat, either governmental or divine, to be no more Milton studies, I would consider this a personal loss. But if you were to ask me, is it a loss for all mankind? I would say, nah, not much. A little drop in the ocean, maybe, but there are a lot of other drops. So, but this is something that if you set up a class on 17th century poetry, or if you set up a class on theories of astronomy in the 18th century, or if you set up a class in Byzantine art, there are, as in the movie Field of Dreams, there are people who will come. There are people who will come, and then you and those people sit in a room. And you have, and I've used this word before, a lot of fun unpacking these ideas, texts, and problems. Now, there is, of course, several administrative issues. One is an administrative issue of the fact that many courses in the fields that I've named, many programs in the fields that I have named, have been cut or abandoned, or perhaps merged in other universities, where certain kinds of cost-benefit analyses, which are, of course, in some way necessary, are being performed. And so how do you deal with that kind of situation? Well, my solution would be of course, to return to, if not the good old days, at least the old days, where there are very strict distribution requirements, as there may be here. I don't know. And as there certainly are not in many of the universities that I know of. It doesn't seem to me that you should have a consumer culture where students are allowed to choose what they study. It seems to me that you should have a culture in which the professionals decide what students should be studying and what academic enterprises should be supported by student tuition, and then you should devise university structures to make sure that those students fill those seats whether they want to or not. And I would extend that mentality, which will have now been recognized as my characteristic mentality, to almost all aspects of university life. Look, if we're looking for a way to justify ourselves either to the heavens or to the governors or to the donors, we're not going to find it. If we want to maintain humanistic study, either we have to have the good fortune to land up in a place like Wake Forest, where obviously they are being maintained, or if we are not in possession of such a good fortune, we have to make pains in the asses of ourselves to the administrations at other universities, and never as an academic enterprise go hat in hand to anyone. Go, in fact, in ways that will, within 30 seconds, make them think to themselves, what can I do so that these people will never visit me again? I offer training in that.
This is probably a note on which we can all agree, so I will invite you all to thank our panelists very much, and thank you too.
And I want to thank you, Rebecca, for hosting, and once again thank Ed Ayers for coming from the University of Richmond and Stanley Fish for coming over from Florida to be with us this weekend. This concludes the Humanities Institute's weekend symposium and launch celebration. Thank you all very much for coming.